Good morning, everybody. I warmly welcome you to the second Erbil Forum. My name is Omar Ahmed Moradi, the head of economic desk in Rudaw. I'm directing this session, this panel on energy change in Middle East and new player with my guests, Matthew Zais, from HKN Company, vice chairman of the company. Mr. Zais has a lot of experience with energy department of United States. And Mr. Robin Mills, the CEO of Qamar Energy, which daily and weekly and monthly publishing a very important report about dynamic of energy and oil market. And Mr. Ahmed Tabakshali, who has a very well-known about his research in Iraqi economy and global issue as well. The war in Ukraine actually has changed a lot of mechanism of energy transition and energy production and also export. And it caused actually the European countries to look for new source of supply, and that is why the Middle East actually can be a good alternative for consumers like European countries. On the other hand, in Iraq, we have ongoing negotiations between Iraq and Kurdistan region on hydrocarbon law, which can impact regional problems and can cause a major breakthrough if the two parties suddenly reach an agreement. Otherwise, it can make new issues in the Middle East. And also we have some regional dispute between Iraq and Turkey about Kurdish oil export to the market, and the rulings by International Chamber of Commerce, which last week actually it ruled. Although it is not known the final ruling, but many believes that it maybe actually would be against the Turkey. So I start with Mr. Mills. That do you think that the ongoing Ukraine war can bring an opportunity to gas-producing nations like Kurdistan region to implement their export plan?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you firstly to the Rudaw Forum for inviting me here. Very pleased to speak, and always a pleasure to be in Erbil. I think this is an absolutely critical question that you ask, Omar. There is really a very sharp disconnect in the gas world between before the 24th of February 2022 and after it. The gas world is going to be radically different. When you eliminate the world's largest gas exporting country as a serious power from its biggest market, everybody else has to adjust, and that means not only Europe, but it means all major gas exporting countries, and that includes, of course, the Middle East, it includes the USA and others, and all major gas importing countries as well. So that, of course, means, not only Europe, but it means China, Japan, India, and many other countries. So they all have to adjust, and gas is being shuffled around the world in quite a dramatic way. And there is a search in Europe at the moment for new sources of energy in general, and a lot of that will be renewable energy, but there's also a need to replace this gas into Europe. So Europe is looking around, it's looking at North Africa, it's looking at the Caspian region, and it's also looking at the Middle East as possible sources of new gas. And there is very definitely an opportunity for any Middle East gas exporter who could increase their supplies to Europe. That is a key opportunity for the Kurdistan region and for Iraq in general. The Kurdistan region, of course, is a significant gas producer today, but for its own use. It's not a gas exporter yet, but it has potential. There's certainly no shortage of resources in the ground. There are large gas fields, but what's needed are the investments and the commercial coordination and the political will and alignment to develop those projects. And I mean, the obvious opportunity here is to send gas from the Kurdistan region through Turkey, either to supply the Turkish market and to free up other gas to flow onto Europe, or to flow directly through Turkey into southeastern Europe and Italy, where there's already existing infrastructure. So this is absolutely a key opportunity, but it will need a lot of political coordination on all sides, both within the Kurdistan region and within Iraq, and also with its partners in Europe and elsewhere.
Mr. Mills, what should the government of Kurdistan region should do to attract investment for this gas development you mentioned?
Well, firstly, I think there needs to be a very clear strategy on how the gas is going to be developed and how it's going to be used. Obviously, the first priority is to meet Kurdistan's own needs, and that means gas for the power sector to give reliable power, and then gas for the industrial sector to help develop the local economy, create employment, and so on. Those things can be done with relatively moderate amounts of gas production. Then the surplus could be directed to export. And the Kurdistan region needs a clear strategy for that export. And I've mentioned Turkey, but there is, of course, also the possibility of selling gas to the rest of Iraq, gas and or electricity, and helping build the relations with Baghdad, as we heard just now. And I think both of those tracks should be pursued in parallel, and they're not mutually exclusive. The region could do both. So there needs to be a clear strategy, and there needs to be a clear strategy for how the investors will see an attractive return on their investment, how they will receive a fair price for the gas that they're producing and developing, and how it will be financed. You know, a pipeline to Turkey, an major export project, is a project of billions of dollars. So it'll need some major companies, it'll need backing from international financial institutions. So there needs to be a very clear structure for that investment.
So do you think that regarding the pricing, potential Kurdish gas can compete with future gas supplies, especially from Azerbaijan, from Russia?
Well, the work we've done shows that, yes, the Kurdish gas can be competitive, certainly in Turkey, and given the rise in prices in Europe in general, and given the need for new gas supplies, it can be competitive in southeastern Europe and potentially in Italy. That was probably not the case a couple of years ago, but it is the case now. It doesn't need to be competitive against Azerbaijan. We don't really see Azerbaijan as the competitor. Really, you know, Europe is trying to replace Russian gas, and of course, Russian gas has largely been cut off anyway. And then liquefied natural gas imports from around the world, which are quite expensive, and so it's relatively easier to compete with.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. I come to Mr. Zais. How United States can ease this gas expansion in Kurdistan region, and how can help Kurdistan region in developing their gas resources?
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Rudaw for hosting the conference. So the question is, how does the United States support the Kurdistan region's gas and oil? And I think we probably ought to zoom out. First is that it is an international gas market. It's an international oil market. In the last couple of years, the focus of the international community has drifted away from Iraq, and the focus has been on issues such as Russia, obviously, and their invasion of Ukraine, China, and more so Iran. I think the focus has returned a bit to Iraq, maybe not for good reasons, particularly because of the internal divisions and the questions over its future energy and the ability for the country to continue along a path with its constitution. For the United States has determined that the Kurdistan region is a place that's welcome to gas investment. I think Dana Gas can testify to that they, like our company, have U.S. government financing from the Development Finance Corporation they have it for gas development. So the United States, though, I think is watching to see, can Iraq implement an agreement for the budget, for an oil and gas law? Can the Kurdistan region be unified as it represents the Kurds in Baghdad? And the international community is watching, I think, in terms of Iraqi institutions and the direction that Iraq is going to take, and whether it's going to continue to more and more so align with its neighbor in Iran, or it's going to welcome, in a new way, international investment from places other than China.
Mr. Zais, recently a United States delegation led by Mr. McGurk and including Mr. Amos Hakiston visited Kurdistan region. do you think that the United States can mediate between Iraq and KRG to reach a common ground in getting a unified federal oil and gas law?
It's 2023, and Iraq does not have an oil and gas law. So the question is, what needs to change in order for it to have one? And I think it's clear that it needs to. I think it would solve a lot of problems, particularly because it would be the parliament legislating the future of Iraq's oil and gas resources. And it would also put to bed the question of the integrity of Iraq's institutions in what appears to be fairly political judicial rulings. So yes, I think if we haven't had an oil and gas law for 16 years in Iraq, then it's probably going to take external mediation and probably with some coercive powers, and I think that the United States could play that role. From what I understand, they're willing to play that role, but some things need to happen also internally to Kurdistan. It needs to be providing a united front as a Kurdistan regional government, both externally and internationally, but also with Baghdad. And it also needs to, and I think the United States could play an instrumental role bridging the gap between Erbil and Baghdad that has existed for the last 16 years.
Mr. Tabakhshali, I just want to ask you why Kurdistan regional government and Iraq has been so far from reaching an agreement over the energy. For example, they have been talking about oil and gas law since 2007, and they have not reached a practical agreement on this. Do you think that it is just internal issues related to the constitution, Iraqi constitution, or possibly we have some external factor that do not allow the two sides reaching agreement?
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Rudaw, and thank everybody for coming in and listening. The thing is, in all the discussions that have taken place throughout the years between the federal government and the KRG, they've always looked at technical solutions to a fundamental problem. And that doesn't work, because the difference between the two sides is not a question of how do we interpret Article 111 and 112. It's not that. It's actually on the nature of the federation itself. The agreement, there's different views on how we look at Iraq as a federal structure. We either look at Iraq as a federal structure more like a very strong center, or a federal structure where the peripherals have more power. Because when it comes to Article 11112, you're talking, there's a phrase that everybody uses, but nobody really sort of knows the meaning of it. It says the federal government together with the producing governors. The word together is actually very loaded, because basically, how do you work together? Who drives whom? I.e., does the KRG have, let's say, a 17% representation in the thing, or is it a 50-50? And as long as you don't resolve that, nothing will ever be resolved on that issue. So I think the two parts, before going on a federal oil and gas law, they need to go and find a common understanding of how they want the relationship to be. I mean, like, it just doesn't work. And the evidence of it is, you look in the last 17 or 18 years, we've had budget agreements, but they failed before the ink dried on them. And they failed because they don't take the fundamental issues into account. And also, they have a lot of internal failings whereby they are not enforceable, they're not implementable, and they've never been win-win. I think this is really where the obstacle is. So I see everybody discussing technicals, and they're fine. But if you don't resolve the fundamental issue, I can't see it actually ever taking place.
Don't you think any external factor within all these past years that...
I think the external factor is very important with what Matthew says here. We haven't had a law in 16 years, so we definitely need external help. But the thing is, we need our external people who help us to understand the fundamental issues. Because I think as well, even when we get external help, it's most on technical and short-term stopgap measures. So everybody, including our international partners, need to understand the fundamental issue, approach it that way. Because if we solve that, we can unlock Kurdistan's gas potential, Iraq's own gas potential. A lot of the issues we can resolve once and for all.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Tabakhshali. Do you have any comment on?
This is on. I was just going to note that we're honored to have former Ambassador Jim Jeffrey and General Jay Garner, who probably should be sitting here instead of us discussing the origins of the Iraqi Constitution and its meanings, because I think you're right, Ahmed. I think it goes back to what did it take to get to all the parties to the table to sign up to this experiment, this new Iraqi experiment under the Iraqi Constitution of 2005? And that's the question that I think is still being posed and fundamental that Ahmed says is, what were those things that the United States, and that's I think why the United States has a critical role here, is to be at the table and say, this is what we promised all the parties about this Constitution, about the future of Iraq, to get them to the table to agree and to sign to that Constitution. And that's probably where it needs to return to and start from.
Yeah, a very interesting view. Mr. Robin, how many percent we have a chance of reaching agreement between KRG and Iraqi federal government over oil and gas?
Well, look, it's a very challenging problem, and we know we've spent, and many of us around in the room and spent a lot of time trying to resolve these issues or give their advice on it. I think the way I look at it, right, the oil case I think is particularly difficult because it's close to a zero sum, right? Baghdad wants more control over the Iraqi oil sector. The Kurdistan region wants to have more control over its sector itself. And a dollar lost from the budget here is a dollar gained by someone else. That's a difficult one to resolve. And as Ahmed reminds us, there has to be some fundamental agreement between the two parties on what does federalism mean in the Iraqi context. I think the gas and electricity sector are more promising because I think there's much more room for a win-win there. If Kurdistan region has gas and it has surplus electricity or could provide surplus electricity with that gas. The rest of Iraq, of course, as we know, is very short of gas and electricity. And this gas at the moment, most of it is sitting in the ground and not being developed. And it could be developed and it could bring cleaner fuel to the country and for export, and it can bring a new source of revenues, some diversification, it can bring industrial development. There's a lot more room for a win-win between the two parties on that. And so I think that's really a place to focus on. And I think it's also helpful just to start small. If they've just established the principle that, there is some trade of gas between the Kurdistan region and the rest of Iraq, some trade of electricity, there is some maybe small-scale exports of gas to Turkey, and just have a process that can gain some momentum. It's not necessary to jump in with the giant, multi-billion-dollar schemes that try to solve everything. I think best to take things step by step. And then that creates some room in which there can be negotiation on the other issues, of course, many of which lie outside the energy sector.
Thank you, Robin. I just want to say that if anybody want to raise a question to our dear guests, please in WhatsApp message us on this number 0750-530-0009 so I can get the question and ask from our guests. You mentioned about the possible and common factor can suddenly make some sort of agreement between the two sides. I just want to ask Mr. Tabakhshali, how about the recent rulings by ICC and its impact on current negotiation, the International Chamber of Commerce that summoned just recently and issued some rulings on this dispute between KRG and Turkey, Iraq and Turkey.
As you know, the rulings are not out, but we're sort of everybody's expecting a ruling in favor of Iraq. Now, obviously, that changes the bargaining power of either side. It makes it very difficult on the KRG side to export, because presumably the ruling says that the counterparty or the party that has the right to market the oil is the federal government. And if that's the case, then clearly that changes the dynamics very much in between both sides significantly, as well as the ruling last year on the Federal Supreme Court, irrespective of the political connotations on it. It is the final arbiter on the land. And so therefore, these two things complicate them. But personally, I think if we all sort of think holistically, I mean, within Iraq and also international partners, Robin mentioned, for example, gas. Gas is tremendous. One of the work I've been doing a lot over the years is looking at the relationship in the budget between the two sides. The numbers cannot add up. The numbers don't make sense. However, if you input gas into them, that can something which could be fairly significant. It's a combination that can work. Also with Turkey, we have issues with Turkey when it comes to water issues and so forth. If we put them all together in a way whereby we have a win-win situation for all, it can work. I mean, certainly the dynamics have changed, but they're not straightforward as well.
Thank you, Mr. Tabakhshali. Mr. Zais, I want to just ask you about the recent decision by federal Supreme Court in Iraq against Kurdistan oil and gas law, as well as Kurdistan region contract with oil companies. You as HKN, a United States-based company, how see this such decision and ruling by Iraqi courts?
So I think, to Ahmed's point, I think whether you take the ICC ruling or rulings in Baghdad, there's opportunities for win-win solutions and there's opportunities for lose-lose solutions. You can conceive of a scenario where an ICC ruling not effectively negotiated between Baghdad and Ankara can be a big lose-lose scenario, particularly when both sides have significant concerns with each other, whether it's water or security or oil and gas. And the flip side, there's win-win. I think for our perspective on the rulings in Baghdad, our perspective is for Iraq, in some respects, it shined a light on Iraq in a negative way because it questioned the legitimacy of some of its institutions. For us, we're a company that has been here since 2007. We invested over $1.8 billion in the Kurdistan region, and we've done so because many legal rulings outside of Iraq have demonstrated that the Kurdistan region is an investable destination, and why, in some regards, the oil sector in the Kurdistan region is a miracle, going from 0 to 450,000 barrels in a little over 15 years. And that's been done on zero domestic funding, all from international investment. And so that's why a win-win solution going forward is going to be critical, because the world is watching. International capital has a lot of places to go. It can go and invest in oil and gas in lots of places. And the question is, does it want to come to Iraq? Does it want to come to Kurdistan? And that's a big question that's going to depend on the actions that Erbil, Baghdad, Ankara, and others take going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Zais. We have a question from Rawaz from Iraq Oil Report for Mr. Tabakhshali. You say the KRG Baghdad issues have not been solved because the fundamental issues have not been addressed. Can you please elaborate on that? What are the fundamental issues, please?
I think to go over the fundamental issues, all of them is significant, but basically the concept is if you think of the simple terms of, let's say, how you have a Federal Oil and Gas Council, right? If you look at it from the Baghdad perspective, you will have, let's say, a 12-member or a 10-member, whatever number they had in the past, and the KRG would have 2 voices. So basically, they do have a voice, but they can't stop it, they can't change it, and so forth. On the other hand, on the KRG side, you come to the issue of, no, I want to have 6 by 6. It's a real difference in terms of how you look at it. The working together is who is leading whom. Also, when it comes in, let's say, one of the issues that were problematic in the discussions in 2007, and that is how you get the mechanism payment. You have one way, the money gets paid into an account controlled by the federal government, and then the KRG gets its share. Now, on the KRG side, that's unacceptable. What they were looking for is automatically the money will be allocated between the 2 accounts. So there is a huge difference between them, and that underpins how they look at each other. If you look at each other as equals within a loose federal structure. It's very different when you have a very strong federal center that dictates policy. And you know, as an Iraqi who lived and knew what it was like to have a very, very strong center, none of us actually want ever return to something like that. But that has to be agreed by both parts before they enter discussion. Say, we have to resolve that. Otherwise, you can discuss till forever on the technicals, but you can never agree on how you resolve it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Tabakhshali. Because of timing actually is limited, I want to just ask the final question, Mr. Robin Mills. In 5 years from now on, how do you see the future of oil and gas sector in Kurdistan region in different scenarios? Will we see again IOCs, major companies coming back to Kurdistan region and investing again?
Look, I think the question of investment, and Matt raises this, and very importantly, it's very important to be an attractive investment destination. Oil and gas companies today, they're in a decarbonising world. They're under pressure from shareholders. They are under pressure to be very selective in their investments, and they have many opportunities. They can be in North America, they can be in Guyana, they can be in parts of Africa. They have a lot of investment opportunities. This is not the world of 20 years ago when the investment opportunities were very short and very difficult to find. Now, the Kurdistan region certainly has great oil and gas resources, and particularly now on the gas side, but it has to have the right above ground conditions. And that means doing its best to put its own domestic house in order and to do what it can to work productively and constructively with Baghdad, recognizing all the difficulties and the challenges of that. If it can do that successfully, I think over the next 5 years we could see progress towards some major gas projects. Would we be at the stage of major exports within 5 years? Maybe not, but at least on the path to seeing that. And maybe starting with some of these small-scale projects that I mentioned, with relatively modest amounts of gas going to federal Iraq and or to Turkey. That I think would be a realistic and a reasonable aim. Even that, we shouldn't underestimate the difficulties. But there is a window of opportunity on this. I mentioned decarbonisation. Europe needs gas right now. Europe will not need large amounts of gas, not in its own view anyway, in 20 years' time. So there is a window of opportunity to get these resources to market while the customers still want them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robin Mills, Mr. Ahmed Tabakhshali, and Matthew Zais for being part of this panel. Thank you also for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.